Good morning. Welcome to the Supply Chain Mapping webinar, Improving Your ROI with Supply Chain Mapping, hosted by Manitoba Agriculture in collaboration with Supply Chain Canada. My name is Annette Allen. I am a business development specialist with the Value Added branch of Manitoba Agriculture. We would like to start the webinar by recognizing that Manitoba is on the treaty territories and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyate, Denesalin, and Nehethawak peoples. We acknowledge Manitoba is located on the homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge Northern Manitoba includes lands that were and are the ancestral lands of the Inuit. We respect the spirit and intent of treaties and treaty making and remain committed to working in partnership with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. It is my pleasure today to introduce our presenter, Reid with Supply Chain Canada. Rick has over 25 years of supply chain experience in both the public and private sectors. He specializes in optimizing supply chains and has helped organizations develop strategies to maximize their efficiency and profitability. Rick will guide us through the critical role of supply chain optimization and how supply chain mapping can be a game changer for your business. Just a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. Rick will address questions at the end of the presentation. So enter your questions into the chat function and we will respond to them later. Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annette, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'll jump right in. I got an awful lot. I'm going to try to do my best to cover off the material. There's quite a bit, and I want to leave as much time as possible for questions at the end. When we get into this, I'm going to try to, give you an overall understanding of a process that supply chain does in your business. But the big question is exactly this: can your supply chain keep up? Is it capable of doing the things that you need it to do in order to be successful? Is it capable of giving you the return on investment, that makes it worthwhile going and doing what you're doing? And this is a question a lot of people, they may have a sense of, but in many ways don't really know. This is one of the examples. I just pulled this out from a report. It's a little older. It's from 2022, but it talks about consumer good companies, which a lot of you guys would probably fall into. But the report says that, that when you look at inefficient supply chains within these organizations, are going to cost them about $800 billion in growth, over the next, few years. It starts to make you wonder, well, how efficient is my supply chain? How good am I really? Right? Yes, I'm in business. Yes, I can open the doors the next day. Yes, I'm making money. But am I making as much as I should be? How much am I leaving on the table? And that's really what, we're going to be talking about a little bit today. Takeaways. Really, it's about the importance of investing in your supply chain function. The more you invest in that function, having people that have the tools and the authority and the ability to go execute on your behalf, the more your business is going to benefit. About the importance of making things visual, right? Like instead of having it, up here or in somebody else's head or thinking, what's going on, make it visual so that everybody can start from the same point of view. It's going to be about supply chain mapping itself, which is different than process mapping. Process mapping or systems mapping is looking at all those steps that are going on. Supply chain mapping is looking at those relationships upstream and downstream and where you're at risk and where you have opportunities to improve. And I do want to touch base a little bit on, moving from a linear model to a circular model in your supply chain and how it can help your business going forward. I don't have a lot of time to go into it, but I do want to touch on it just as food for thought, and we'll probably follow up with another seminar on that at a later date. I do want to give you a little bit of context because some of you guys might be a little more knowledgeable than others, but just to make sure everybody's coming from the same point is, what is supply chain management? Well, in a nutshell, it's how you deliver your goods and services. It's how you fulfill that promise to your customers. You're going out, you're making sales. You said, yes, we're going to get this quality product to you at this time at the right price or at this price, or whatever. And it's how you do that. And it's everything from your internal, what's going on in your four walls, to your external partners, both upstream, down, even your customers. But it's also a focus on what does that end customer want. It has four primary functions. There's a lot more to it. This is very simplistic when I say this, but it revolves around sourcing, procurement, transportation, and warehousing. And you need those functions to be well integrated and work together to get the best results for your organization, to get the best return on investment if you're going out to try and introduce a new product or those sort of things. It involves everything, upstream and down, from the point of origin to the point of consumption at your customer. Characteristics that you would see in a world-class supply chain, we're all there. I'm not going to touch on every one of them, but some of the key ones are, the flexibility, being able to scale up and down. And in this current environment, when you see tariffs up and down like a yo-yo, and you see, not sure what's going on, you need a supply chain that's scalable, that you can turn the tap off. So you don't have products coming in that you owe money on, and then you can ramp up quickly if all of a sudden opportunity comes. You saw that in COVID when, you had the panic buying of things like toilet paper and hand sanitizer. You had suppliers that were limited capacity, but didn't have an ability to scale up to meet this crazy demand. But you had other people where all of a sudden demand cratered and they couldn't turn the tap off fast enough, and you have all this product coming in and no sales to get rid of it. So you want to make sure that you have that ability to be flexible and be ahead of the curve, which is one of the things we're going to be looking at. Resiliency is just how long it takes you to, get back to normal after you have an unexpected event. But the really big one at the end is, how can your supply chain learn faster and adapt quicker? How can you as a business understand what's going to happen quicker so you can respond faster, right, to take advantage of opportunities or avoid risks? And that's where supply chains can really become, your secret weapon. How does it work? Well, it's not really rocket science, but it's about having a supply chain strategy that complements your corporate strategy and what your value proposition to your customers is. So if you're about, top quality, then your supply chain needs to be structured in a way that ensures that you have the best quality along the way, that you're not looking at the best price, because we know price and quality are related. But where what happens is that you have all those partners and all those people in your supply chain are making decisions that ensure the highest quality of your products. So that comes around to your strategy. Constant state of continuous improvement, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's about knowing what adds value and what doesn't. What's a customer willing to pay for, and what are they not? And if they're not willing to pay for it, stop doing it. And it does focus on integration and information sharing, internally, externally, up and downstream, because without information, you're just kind of fumbling around in the dark. And that's a little bit about the whole purpose of the mapping process that we're going to be talking about. It's about help to get that integration. It's about that information sharing. It's about having people come at, the problem, within your supply chain that from a common point of view. So why, right? So why optimize? Why map your supply chains, for the purpose of optimizing it? Well, this is why. It's a competitive advantage. If you're capable of delivering your goods and services, just like it says on the screen, to your customers faster, cheaper, which is relative, again, but at the right price, more consistently than your competitors, you'll have a competitive advantage. Because if you can do that better than your competitors, you become the supplier of choice. You become your products become their products of choice because they can trust you. You're delivering on that value proposition that you're putting out there to your customers. That's why investing in your supply chain and mapping it and that continuous improvement, always looking for those opportunities, is so critical because it's what drives this. Again, why optimize? Why go through the process we're going to talk about? Well, there they are. I don't need to really go into them. I think everybody wants those if you're in business. It's a difference between staying in business and not. But this is the things that you get by going through the process that we're going to talk about. So the question is, where do we start? Well, and I threw up, and I love that saying because everybody's probably heard it before. If you don't know where you are, you're never going to get to where you're going. And that's the case, in this situation is that, I imagine you all have successful businesses. And I think it's fair to say they're probably not, not all of them are successful as you want to be. You probably think that there's ways that you could be better and you'd like to grow. But if you don't really understand the true current state or where you are right now, you can't make that plan as, okay, well, that's where I want to be. Here's where I am, and here's the plan to get there. And so mapping is the starting point of how do you create, that roadmap? How do you make it visual? And how do you give yourself that roadmap to say, okay, here's my current state, there's my future state. These things have to change for me to get there. Now I can start coming up with my game plan. I can play my budgets. I can put my resources. I know what to do. I can prioritize. I'm not going chasing the wrong thing. I'm not trying to fix a symptom rather than a problem, right? So this is where it starts. And this is probably one of the most important steps. Well, I think it is. Some people might argue, but I think it is. So what does it do for you? Well, mapping does exactly that. It's going to help me identify all the activities in your organization. Like, what are the activities that are happening? And if I'm a betting man, I would argue that most of you guys, if you're the principal of your organization, you probably don't know all of the activities that are going on, that are happening behind the scenes, or people are doing to band-aid a bad process or to get through. Yeah, and so, and it's not a criticism of you. It's just a reality that as humans, we can't always, in the back of our head, when we look at something, see everything that's going on, where somebody is doing something that, geez, the process is working great, but no, it's working great because Joe over there is putting extra time in to do this, this, and this because, we made poor decisions. You're going to know about touch points and handoffs. You're going to know about when responsibility changes, right? And there's a big one that we'll try to talk about here in a minute when I show an example. But how many handoffs are there? How many times do I have to hand off to somebody else for somebody to do something else? How many times do I have to go and get permission to go do something rather than it fits within the parameters of the scope? It allows you to determine which activities are going to add value and which ones don't. For the purpose being that if it does no value, it's just costing you time or money. Stop doing it. And if you have to do it, for a reason, then find a way to do it quickly as possible so you minimize the impact. You're going to determine your process times. You're going to determine associated costs that go with it, and it's going to allow you to determine what's called a critical path, which some people may be familiar with. But a critical path is basically what's the most efficient path through your process from the start to the end. The one that gets you from conception to out the door, the most effective and economical and profitable way. What is that path? And that's part of what you're looking for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you something here. And I'm just going to introduce it real quick. This is an example of not everything that I would be doing. And don't worry about, you can't read the writing necessarily. I know it's too small, but it's the only way I can get the whole thing on. This is a process of one of the ones that I was doing on some work I did with one of the mines up north. And this had to do with purchasing, right? Just a small piece of it. There's a whole bunch of things that are around it, but this was the particular project I was doing. And it involved vendor managed inventory, it involved special orders, and it involved orders that came from, the warehouse itself. And it showed all of the steps, that were involved in that. And you had steps within steps, like the expediting process, for example, over here, or the delivery, of goods process that's right there. So it would even explode out a little bit more. The point of this isn't for you to go, oh, geez, what are all these different things? It's to show you how complex, it can get and where the opportunities. And part of what our process is when we found as we went through all this, is that the blue steps included my staff, my direct staff, right? And what we found was that we had a CRM system, that handled our purchase orders, that had a whole bunch of capability that we never implemented. And that I actually had the opportunity to take these steps in blue and automate some of them, where it would allow my people to go work on things that helped add value, go work on negotiating new deals, go work on other problems, instead of doing administrative stuff like this. And so I had an efficiency thing there where I had, 8 buyers that were basically doing paperwork instead of doing things that actually helped the organization save money or get more efficient. But this process allowed me to identify what those were to justify why we were going to go shift our process and to go sell the idea to other departments. Let me just close this off here. There we go. So as I said, this is where that map is an example of what you're doing, what we're talking about you want to do. You want to figure out what it is that's happening in your organization. And then from there, you take a look at it and what helps, what doesn't help, what can I eliminate, what do I change, how do I get more efficient? Other benefits. It's a single point of reference. If I go back to that map I just showed you, it's a single point of reference. It doesn't matter who you are. It could be my team. It could be the finance guy. It could be the president of the organization. It could be a supplier who fits in there somehow, like one of the vendor managed inventory guys. It could be a customer, if necessary. But what happens is that it's a single point of reference where everybody's working off the same playbook. Is that everybody can look at it and say, well, I don't agree with that. What about this step? What about that step? Right? But what happens is that it's efficient because instead of everybody kind of doing what they think's happening, you have the one point where everybody agrees, okay, that's the current state. What does future state look like? And how does that process need to change to get us to future state? It makes communication easier and more effective. Like if I just bring that back for a sec, right? You guys, probably know nothing about the mining industry. But if I were to send this to you and let you take a look at it for that thing, you, in a very short period of time, would understand the purchasing process, for handling vendor managed inventory, special orders, and warehouse orders for a major mining company. And yet, you probably never set foot in a mine. And that's where communication gets easy. It makes it easy and effective and allows people to get up to speed quicker so you can make better decisions faster. It facilitates better planning because it's easier to see what has to happen because you can question, why are we doing that step? Why can we eliminate that step? Can we automate that step? Can we change how we're doing it to reduce time or money? But it allows everybody to make better decisions because again, if your team knows that, you might say, hey, look, we're focusing on this, this, and this. But if the team understands, right, one of your employees understands how their step you maybe not working on right away fits in. Hey, I fit into this, and if I do this better, this helps. They can make those one of 1,000 decisions that your employees probably make every day without you from the same frame of reference that actually complements your efforts rather than contradicts them or moves you at cross purposes. So it helps coordination of your people, even indirectly, just on how they do their daily jobs. So it's supply chain mapping. Okay, so we talked about process mapping. Process mapping and systems mapping are, what's the system from when that order hits the door to the time it goes out, for example? What are all the steps and all the handoffs that are in that process. I mean, going back to the example, that's a piece of it, but where are all the other steps that feed into this, right? And feed out of it in terms of how does that order come in the door and how does it get out the other door? Everything that happens in between. That's your process or system mapping. Supply chain mapping is when you start getting into your external, relationships. And here's a simple supply chain map. As you can see, this might be you right here. These are your tier one suppliers. And I say this simple because most organizations on average deal with roughly 100 different suppliers, for services and parts and all those different things that go into it. And some might be very small. We're buying a single item and spending a couple $1,000s a year, where you might have a strategically critical supplier, which is making up 80% of your volume, but they're important. But you think of these are your tier one, those are people you're directly doing business with. But then you have the people they're doing business with, right? And they may have upwards to 100 suppliers or more each, right? And then there's who these guys are dealing with, and so on and so on. So the question is, every one of these people that contributes in your network is costing you time and money potentially. Because again, there's a cost associated. It all builds up till it gets to you. But if anybody here is inefficient, if anybody here is not have a good cost structure, they're costing you time and money. Now, you can't go right to here right off the bat, but the thing is you can start taking a look at how are these people. Let's map them out. Let's find out where we're doing business, who we're doing business with, and let's figure out a way to evaluate them, right? Are they the best option for us? Are there better options, right? Are they taking steps to be more efficient, to help reduce their costs, which means that I should be able to get a better price? Are they improving quality? Are they, mitigating their risks where it's not putting me at risk because somebody's doing something crazy? So what happens is, each of these things, you want to have this mapped out so you know where you're at risk. And a good example of this, I'm going to go back to COVID for a sec, is that we had a manufacturer here in Winnipeg, international, the largest domestic manufacturer of products in their industry in North America. And when COVID hit, the city of Wuhan, like where everything was the epicenter, was the source of a single source product they needed for their equipment. Like they had a specialized motor that came out of a supplier in that city. And when the Chinese government said, that's it, nothing's coming in out of that city, these guys were hooped because they had a single source product that all of a sudden got turned off, not of their doing, it got turned off because the government said, that's it. And all of a sudden they've got orders and everything's got to go for a product and they don't have the one product they need. So all of a sudden now they're expedited. They're trying to jerry rig something that's not meant for that to get into it and do the engineering and do all these things and go to the cost, we'll replace it later, right? All because they didn't manage the risk that was associated with that. And if they had mapped out this, they would have seen that. They probably should have known about it originally, but the thing is, by mapping it, you're going to see that on those strategically critical products. And that's the value you get into here. And as I said, point of origin, point of consumption, information flow, right? And so you're not only looking at the map of your supply chain, but you can also evaluate how effective is information flowing up and down. How much am I learning about what's happening and other shortages or new innovations, or those things come from the supplier side and from the customer side on demand that I can filter up to those guys so that these guys can make better decisions based on that demand. So, but how does this, so again, just furthermore, how does it help you? Well, it documents your network from point of origin to point of consumption. And it allows you to identify the risks or bottlenecks. Where am I at risk? Where am I getting products from China right now? Like, for example, a mapping process in this current environment, if you're wanting to sell into the States, which is going to be difficult for the next little bit, but if you want to sell into the States, the one thing that you probably want to avoid is anything in your supply chain coming from China, because it's simply going to get held up at the border. It's going to get tariffed like crazy, and you're not going to be competitive. So mapping your supply chain, you might look at your immediate suppliers and go, hey, none of them are related in China. But the question is, when you go to the tier 2 or tier 3, are there products in there that are coming from China? And are you at risk? And should you be redirecting it? You should be trying to get your supplier to put pressure on them guys to redirect it, and get it from somewhere else that's not going to get treated the same way as that. So that's an example of where mapping starts to figure out those kind of risks. It's also going to help you identify potential cost savings. You might want to consolidate suppliers, right? You might have different suppliers that, hey, you know what, we've always been using this and we've been using this over here, but this guy can actually produce this. We're buying just this product from somebody, one thing, but we're buying, 20 things from this guy and they have the ability to do a version of that. Maybe I should be looking at these guys to see if they can, if we can make their product work, or if they can do design changes to make it better so I can use it, where I can eliminate that supplier, right? I can consolidate, and all of a sudden then I have one less freight bill, I have less carbon footprint, I have, less processing fees for doing purchase orders. So it does allow you to start to go take a look at where can I consolidate, where can I reduce my freight, where can I, reshore some things on somebody and maybe put some effort into developing a closer supplier to reduce freight. But you can't do that if you don't have an understanding of where you are. Other benefits, business priorities, right? Either way, whether it's your process or system mapping or your supply chain mapping, it's going to help you identify priorities. Where am I going to get the biggest bang for my buck on making a change? Where should I put my resources to get the best ROI or the best, cost saving, the best efficiency, the best contribution to my bottom line? So it's going to help you make better investment decisions because you're going to have an understanding is I have these options and this one has the best return, potentially the best return. So I'm going to put my money towards that. It's going to allow me to budget more appropriately. It's going to help make my employees more productive because I'm eliminating those things that make them unproductive. I'm going to eliminate, the non-value add steps. I'm going to streamline authorities. I'm going to streamline processes. I'm going to automate where I can, where it's going to make my employees be able to do more or less to make them productive. More productive employees makes your business more productive, which makes it more profitable, which in turn improves your ROI. It makes your continuous improvement efforts more effective. Because again, this isn't a one-step thing, right? You're going to map, you're going to go here, I want to go from here to there. You're going to go do that. And what you're going to do is you're going to rinse and repeat and do it again because you're going to look for the next opportunity. Once you get to that future state, that becomes the current state and you go through it all again. And that's where back to that continuous improvement part that I talked about early in the presentation. I just want to touch on this. Like I said, we don't have enough time to get into all in gory detail, but this is something that I really think you need to take a look at. And this is a factor you may want to look at as you're mapping. Is for those that aren't familiar, circular economy is different than our current linear model, which is kind of take, make, and waste, And basically, it's the idea of keeping products in the system longer. Instead of when something gets to the end of the line, just take it and throw it in the landfill. It's about how do I produce goods in a way that at the end of its life, it can be reprocessed and the raw materials can be reintroduced back in the supply chain somewhere, either as new material or as energy or some person. It keeps equipment in use longer, all in hopes of helping regenerate the environment. Where this helps you when you're looking at these maps is it shows you where you can reduce your costs by shifting to local suppliers or developing local suppliers using these kind of materials, because it's one, going to reduce freight if you're doing something, from, God knows where it's coming from. It's going to reduce that freight cost if you're bringing it in from closer to you. It's going to help you, as governments start to take a look at, are they going to start taxing pollution? I mean, carbon tax has been being repealed, but there's probably going to be some other version of that coming. Of if you're not doing something that is environmentally friendly, you're probably going to pay more for it at some point. Whether it's a service charge, whether it's a tax, whether it's a stewardship fee, who the heck knows? But so the question is, how do you reduce what you're putting in the landfills, right? And so the question is, how do you, instead of getting virgin materials, how do you use material that's all around you? So it's going to provide those opportunities. As I said, that's more of a discussion for a later webinar. But it's also going to maybe provide an opportunity to generate revenue. Is that products that you're done, when you're in your manufacturing process that you're done with, how can you redirect it to somebody else that's willing to pay for it to use them, rather than spend money on sending it to a landfill for tippage. So there are opportunities there, and it may open up new markets for your products. The fact is that, the U.S. and their situation is creating a need for Canadian businesses to diversify where they sell to. And if you want to sell into Europe, because Canada has a free trade agreement, CETA, with Europe, with the European Union, if you want to sell products in there, you do have to show, though, to get in, you're going to have to show that they've been made in an environmentally friendly way. Like, for example, if it's a wood or paper product, you can't sell it into the EU unless you can show that the material came from a non-clear cutting source. It had to come from a sustainable source. It didn't come from clear cuts. Because if you can't do that, your stuff's going to sit on the dock and ain't going anywhere. So it may open up new markets if you can show that your products were made in an environmentally friendly and sustainable manner. So this is something, as you're doing your mapping, it's another consideration that you may want to take a look at. So how does mapping improve my ROI? So I've talked about processes, I've talked about theory, and I gave you a bunch of things, but I want to kind of just on the little bit of time here, I want to just talk a little bit about some specifics about what it actually does. And when you look at this, most of you probably aren't aware of this. It's called profit leverage effect. And basically, it just means that the savings that you can achieve through your supply chain, like through the supply chain savings you can achieve, have a greater impact to your bottom line than the equivalent amount of work it would take to increase sales to get the same result. So it's kind of wordy, and I probably didn't explain it just there as well as I should. So it's a little easier if maybe I get into some of the examples here. So I don't know if you guys are aware, it's something called an empty lift assist. I think if everybody's seen a trailer driving down a road, like a large one, you've got some axles that are lifted up. That's an empty lift assist. And what it does is companies, they put these on trailers so they can lift up the axles when they're empty so that it saves wear and tear on equipment. It means that the tires don't get worn out as much, the shocks, all that sort of thing. It helps save them money on their equipment. And when I was working with a trailer manufacturer, we did end dumps for moving asphalt and gravel and low beds for moving heavy equipment. We put these on almost every trailer. And we had a situation where, we had a single source supplier. As we were looking through the options, we were doing one and we looked through the options and we couldn't find it. We were mapping it and that. And the problem is customers are coming to us saying that we were paying too much. The competitors were considerably less. And so what we did is we went and worked with, we tried to work with that supplier, and they said, not tough, that's our price, and they knew they had us. And so we actually went to a different manufacturer that provided a lot of individual parts that went into an empty lift assist, and we said, we want to develop a new one with you, because most of the stuff's yours. And their R&D people worked with us, and we came up with a new model that was $1,700, right? Instead of $3,600 we were paying for the single source guy. And when you're doing the number of trailers we're doing, that was almost $1 million a year just on that. And it came up when we took a look at our options. We didn't have one. It put the priority on how do we develop somebody new? Because as we did a map of the ecosystem, we found that there was nobody else. It was the best one. Nothing else came up where they wanted it. And so we had to go develop our own. And that's where we ended up focusing our priority on it. Process efficiencies. We take a look at, process efficiencies on supply chain and what you can do. Because when we mapped the system, the process itself, we found that we had a guy making, $30, $35 an hour that would go take in a half an hour, 30 minutes to go pick all the fittings for air brakes, out of the warehouse. And then he'd come back to his desk and then he'd dump them all on there, and he'd spend, a whole bunch of time, taping, putting Teflon tape on all the fittings. And so he'd spend another 45 minutes doing that. And then he would finally get, up, and then he'd finally go over to the trailer and start doing what adds value, which is putting air brakes on the trailer. And so what we did was, once we mapped it, we saw where the time and the money was and the inefficiency. We went back to our suppliers, and I found out that I could actually get kits made up by all the different models of trailers. I can have an individual kit for air brakes made for every model of trailer we had, where not only could I have all the fittings put into a bag, but they could tape it. They could have the Teflon tape already on them. And the taping only cost me about 6 cents extra for the pack. But what happened was it saved me by having those bags where the fittings were there, where instead of the guy wandering around picking stuff, he just had to go grab one bag and the tape's already on it. He was from picking the bag to putting on a trailer within minutes rather than an hour and a half. And that saved us in the productivity about $25,000 a year just for the taping. You get into the next part we looked at where the installation process was, is it's not just fittings, there's hoses, there's the all the other parts as well. But we actually made kits from the supply chain point of view. We made kits where, depending on the model of the trailer, they'd go grab the one box, they'd bring it to the trailer, they open it up. The first thing that went on the trailer was on the top of the box. They'd take that out and they'd put it on. And then the next thing, and the box was ordered in the order of what the installation process was done. So again, we avoided pick times. We avoided playing around because the box was organized in a way that it went on. It made it easier for training. Again, it's an example of how mapping a process, in your supply chain allowed you to use suppliers to help make you more efficient. And it allowed our throughput time on doing those go through a lot faster so we could actually do more trailers than we were before. Again, this one right here, this is more of a supply chain thing. This is mapping it out. But the big one is the efficiencies of the savings, is that we had a process, and it was similar to the one that I showed you, where I had 5 people spent all day processing anywhere from 500 to 600 orders, right? And it was all manual because at the store level, this is an optical company that I used to work for. We had 75 stores across the country. And what they did was that they manually filled out the order. It got faxed to my guys. My guys had to take them in, sort them out. They had to put them into a purchase order, fax the purchase orders. Purchase orders, the confirmations came back. They had to check them all. Then they were all stapled together and they had to all be filed. And it took 5 people all day, 40 man hours to do that every day. And what we did was, by working with IT and others, is that we were able to reduce that down to a couple of people doing it half a day, which saves us about $108,000 because we ended up having it got entered in the system because we had 3 systems that didn't talk to each other. And we had somebody at the POS system that entered it went directly into ours, where it populated the purchase orders, where my guys had to just go check, yeah, that looks right, boom, and they'd go approve. It went up to an FTP site where my key suppliers would go pull the file down and dump it into their system, right? And my guys are off negotiating new deals to help save money. But it improved our productivity and our return because it put more people on things that actually helped us make more money, save more money than just doing admin again. Profit leverage effect. We'll come back, and this is kind of a specific example of that. When I was at that same optical company, we were buying polarized lenses or sunglass lenses from all over the place. And so I consolidated them. We took a look, I mapped it out, I looked at where everything was coming from. It was crazy. We weren't maximizing our spend. And so I consolidated. We went through a process, we came down to 1. And in the first year, we resulted in $117,000 in savings just on polarized lenses. At that time, the average sale for sunglasses was $326. After all of our costs and everything removed, we ended up netting out at $82 per sale. The company took a look at, they felt success was getting an extra store per quarter for every store. So an extra 75 sales per quarter or 300 sales a year was considered a success. So why is that important? Well, 75 extra sales, per 4 quarters, 300. 300 extra sales times 82 is an extra $24,600 on the bottom line. The savings that my team was able to achieve, because again, I got them out of administration work, I got them working on, things that actually had value. That $117,000 divided by 82 was actually the equivalent of getting 1,426 sales without having to do the eye, having them come in and see the eye doctor, and then you spend hours going to figure out which ones they like, and then getting measured up and rating it up, and the lab guys doing it. All that stuff goes away. The savings contributed to this. 1,426 sales versus that, or like which one are you going to want if you're a beer business? But this is an example of what profit leverage effect and how supply chain, if you understand where your costs are, you understand what your people are doing, you can find opportunities to do this. As I said, which one would you rather have? So with that, I'll leave that up for the moment, just so you can take a quick picture of it if you want. But with that, I'm ready if somebody has any questions. I hope I didn't go too quick, but maybe I'll just stop sharing that and go back down to here so I can see what's going on. And there. So hopefully, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw them at me.
Okay, I do have a few questions for you, Rick.
Excellent.
If I want to map my supply chain, should I be mapping all of my products?
No, not, you can, but no, what I would recommend is, map your strategically critical ones. Like every business has, it's kind of the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. Every business has the 20% of their volume is, makes up 80% of their, 20% of their customers make up 80% of their volume. So no, I would focus on the ones that are critical to your business success first. Because if you address those, you're going to be doing well, regardless of whether you're doing poorly on some of the other guys. Like mapping a system for somebody you're spending a couple $1,000 with isn't probably worth your time. But mapping somebody who is a major supplier of a component you absolutely have to have that's key, is worthwhile, because any savings you can find there are going to end up on your bottom line, because the volume are going to have a significant impact on your bottom line.
You mentioned about mapping all activities. How can we map activities that we are not aware of? Are employees willing to admit to inefficiencies?
Yeah, actually, you'd be amazed at how willing they are. Employees, often cases are sometimes afraid to bring things up because they're afraid of repercussions. They don't want to, rock the boat or this and that. But when you actually legitimately go and ask them about their role, they'll tell you what they need, like what could be better. Because it's anything else. Like the people that know how to solve a problem, best know how to solve a problem, are the people that are dealing with it. In my 25 some odd years, I've had some successes, quite a few of them. But most of the ideas weren't mine. What they were was me actually engaging with my people and walking the floor and seeing something look kind of weird or awkward, and just walking up and asking, "Hey, what's going on? That doesn't look good." And they tell you what's going on. And they say, "Well, if you could change something, what would you do?" And they would say, "Well, I would do this, this, and this. And this is why I would do this and this, and this is how it's better." And so what I would do is I would take that information and I would go back and I would use it as part of, mapping out that system to say, okay, yeah, what are the repercussions? Again, you just don't do it in isolation to say, okay, that's a great idea. Now you look at, you do that map to figure out, okay, if we change this, where does it impact? And then I go talk to those other people too. And you come up with a solution that allows you to implement. But you'll find that people want to generally do a good job. And if you give them a chance, you really will get good results. But that's where the process map helps, because they will contribute. And they will, because they want to do better, and they don't want to continually do this Band-Aid thing. If they get rid of it, it drives them nuts. And that's that kind of thing that actually doesn't help your retention. But if you're listening to them, you actually go and listen to them, and you go with the right attitude, so to speak, they will share. And if you follow through, you're going to get better employees that are not only going to help make that work for your own benefit, but they'll be more than happy to share other ideas as they come up. And that's really where, this mapping process, where people can see it, they'll contribute, because it's job security, it's job satisfaction, it's retention, it's you get better people, new people come in, or it's easier for them to get up to speed. There's a lot of benefits from it.
Do you recommend any local businesses that can help with process mapping and building automations?
Well, automations, I'd have to think about that one, but in terms of the mapping, this is something that I don't want to let the cat out of the bag. This is something that we are, I hope it's okay for me to share this, guys, but we are working currently with Manitoba Ag to help provide this service. This is something that Supply Chain Canada can help with. It's something that we're trying to find a way to help your industry in that sense. We're at Manitoba to bring it to your industry. So there are others available, but Supply Chain Canada is certainly one of the options to help you get started on this process and help you build the capacity to take it forward yourself.
When conducting the mapping exercise, should we be collaborating with our tier one suppliers who would have a better visibility of their suppliers?
Yeah, you want to. It just comes to when, and there's maybe could be like personally, and again, I'm not saying this is the only way, but personally, I like to do the internal part first, and then I like to bring suppliers in, those key suppliers in, and share it with them, so that they have an understanding of what's our current state, what's the future state we're trying to get to, and where we need their help. And because they can see it and they can say, you see it right here, this is where I can do these things. But if I go back to that map I showed you saying, hey, but I need you guys to do this, or I need you guys to do that, and how can you help me with this? And then it becomes working closely with them to, one, share their expertise, to bring in their suppliers, that may be involved. But it starts that dialogue and that sharing of information, that collaborative problem solving that really starts to get you good results. If I could take a quick sec just on an example, is when I was with noise control company here in Winnipeg, we built silencers for power generating stations for GE and Pratt and Whitney. They were our major customers, and so they used their turbines to in power generating stations. And as you know, turbines are loud, and so we built the boxes that went around them to help, reduce the noise. And we used a lot of insulation, and we were buying it by the truckload. And the problem was the truckload was coming in, and the shop door where they went unloaded was at the opposite corner diagonally to where it was stored up in a mezzanine. And so it would take some guys, it took 3 guys, better part of a day, to unload that truck, drive it right through production all the time, disrupting production, to get it to the mezzanine up. And we had a near miss where one of those bundles, 300 pounds or whatever, almost fell on somebody who was welding, and it could have been bad. But even when the guys were working to get insulation, they had to leave their station, walk to that corner, go up the ladder, get the insulation, dump it down the chute, climb back down, drag it back to their workstation. That was the process we were in. And so what we did was, when we mapped it out on what was going on and what we wanted to do, we wanted to have point of use. Where we wanted to have stuff come in the door and go right to the point of use to avoid all of that, all those different things. Problem was, I'm buying a truckload to get the price, to get it less. If I buy locally, that my price is going up. So I actually brought in our supplier and said, okay, and I brought in the local guys, and I said, and the deal was, I need you to sell to these guys at a price that they can sell to me at my truckload price, so they can deliver it to me, at point of use, right? And so it worked out. These guys, they worked out because there was a commercial and residential installation. I had to deal with 2 people, but they both agreed. So the supplier sent the truckloads to these guys at a price that they could turn around and sell to me at my truckload price, so it didn't go up. And then they started delivering right to my point of use. So I didn't lose out on my direct savings, but I saved on my labor to unload trucks, every few weeks. I saved on the disruptions that were hard to measure as these people are going through, and I improved my efficiency, because all of a sudden guys were still doing baffles rather than walking and climbing up and down and that. So I hope that kind of explains it a little bit.
Would a process map separate administrative and communication processes from physical handling or movement of goods?
No, it would all be in there. Like, you would show the relationship, because again, the process I showed you was just a piece of one. But if you actually went through It's going to be, you're going to have connecting pieces, but you want to show that because you want to know the relationships. Like, when does communication happening? And but that shows on there because you want to know, one of the big ones that, one of the ones that usually happens, it's usually approvals. Like, it's funny how much everybody in their, well, I have to approve, I have to have control, I have to this and that. Whereas, so you have somebody that does a requisition and all of a sudden it can't go. I can't give it to purchasing to have them go do it quickly. I have to go give it to a supervisor who has to review it, do this and that, and then they sign off, comes back to me, and then I go over here and like that all takes time and money, and that's that part of that thing you're talking about. So you want to take a look at those and are they necessary? And that the mapping process, that we talked about was really, I'm just going to come back to this real quick. I'm just going to go over to this thing. See here. So this right here, is it showing up? Yes. Are you seeing the process map again?
Yes, it's
Yes,
back
we
on
can
here.
see it,
Okay,
Rick.
good. So this right here, this process was initiated because at the mine, we had a problem with special orders. So what happened was the maintenance guys, so they had to go fix a toilet, let's say in one of the areas on the site. So they would put the requisition in, and then they'd get in their truck and they drive, out of the gate and across the street and go to the lumberyard, and they'd go there to pick up the toilet they needed to go install. But the problem was, and that's this process, right? But so this is the one right here. So they send the requisition in, it's printed, we get it. But this process itself right here would sometimes take up to 2 days. And that was the problem, because we had guys that would go get something and then they'd go to get it because they could do it quick and be done. But it was our process of all these steps that ended up being the bottleneck because we couldn't process an order fast enough. And it's because we weren't using a system that said, hey, let's put limits in to what a person can requisition. Like, should a guy whose maintenance job is maintenance, should he have up to $500 authority to requisition something up to $500 so he can send it in, that I don't have to go through an approval process, right, to get a supervisor to sign off to him if I can find one, and where it goes through. And how do I use my system where if the requisition comes from a person that's authorized and it's under the limit that they're allowed, where it generates the purchase order automatically and sends it right to the supplier, right? And then I get my buyers get a report on what's happened so they can look at if something was out of whack. But that's where, when you get into these things, you want to have all those relationships, because any of those connections, those touch points are going to cost you either time or money. And if you want a better return, you want to eliminate those things that don't have value, that cost you time and money.
You mentioned negotiating with suppliers.
Mhm.
Is this a real option for smaller companies that are not purchasing massive quantities of anything?
Yeah. Doesn't mean, I'm not saying you're always going to be successful, but yes, it definitely is. My adage is ask. Sometimes they say yes. I would always try to negotiate everything. I would always try to look, the better I understood, and this is the advantage of this, because when you understand your process and you can streamline, right? When you can streamline things and you can come in and the supplier sees where they fit, where you can reduce. It might be on hey, I'm doing this, my process is ordering this amount, but you know what? An optimal amount supplier might be this, or the frequency I'm doing on supplier is I'm doing it too often or not enough where, at the wrong time of year and stuff. The thing is, if you don't negotiate, you're not gathering information. Negotiation just isn't about, hey, we're going to go beat each other with a stick to see who can get a better price. They can get a higher price or I can get a lower price. It's about negotiation is just one of the tools in collaborative problem solving. Is if you understand the problem that has to be solved, you can figure out who's responsible for doing what, and you can negotiate a fair price to deal with it. Now, when you're smaller, yes, it's harder. But then my question becomes, okay, if you're looking at the supply chain map and you're dealing with that, do you need to deal with that? Is there another option? Is there somebody that's more willing to deal with it? Is there somebody that's more appropriate for your size of business? Is there somebody that you can develop, right? So negotiating is important, but it all depends on if you're easier to do business with, regardless of your size, suppliers will generally want to do that. If you're a pain in the butt, yeah, negotiating, they'll just tell you to go take a long walk off a short pier. But if you're somebody that has got your stuff together and you're clear about what you're after and you're consistent and you work with them on stuff, they will negotiate with you in many cases. As I said, not always, but as you grow, right, that volume comes up and you do have options to go elsewhere. I've had many cases where somebody says, no, they wouldn't do it. And then I started to develop other sources. I took a look at what am I doing? How can I change the supplier? How do I change my product in a way that I can use something else and I have alternatives, right? Because negotiation is really all about BATNA. What's your alternative if you can't get a deal? If you've got a poor BATNA, you're going to get a poor result. If you got a strong BATNA, you're going to get a good result. And that, I'll go back to that example when I talked about the empty lift assists. When that guy told me to go fly a kite, I went and I talked to somebody else and I developed a new supplier for it. And all of a sudden, when he called up wondering where his orders were, I said, "Well, yeah, we got this guy for $1,700, and it looks better than yours, by the way." All of a sudden, that price changed, right? Because all of a sudden now he's going, "Wait a sec," because we're doing 25 trucks a week, so it's at $3,600 a pop, it was a lot of money, and all of a sudden that turned off, and then wow, all of a sudden he got real good at changing. But those things are available, and that's something I'd be happy to talk if somebody want to talk specifically. But yes, it is very much possible.
I have one last question, and it's a great one. How do I differentiate between which steps add value and which do not?
Well, it's really about what's the customer willing to pay for. That's kind of it's a loose way that I try to do it, and I'll go back to the trailer, the air brake example. Customers aren't paying me to have somebody wander around the warehouse and pick materials. They are paying me to make sure that stuff ends up on a trailer. Like the installation. So installation adds value. Wandering around picking things doesn't. Or it's like on your warehouse, on your production floor, if you have, a different company we were at, when guys needed a new drill bit, or a new plasma, a tip for a plasma cutter, to go walk, 70 yards to go to stores, to get a new one and walk back. Because it's not just somebody's going to walk there. They're walking, they're stopping, they're talking to their buddies, they're going doing this and that. Your customer's not paying for that. So, you really need to come down to is it entirely necessary? Is the customer going to see it as something necessary? And that's where you get in a lot. Somebody asked for the previous question about communications or going to get these authorities or paperwork and that. Customers don't want to pay for that because they recognize it just costs them time and money. Inefficiency costs them. They want to get best price too. So it comes down to what's necessary for you to be able to get that product out the door, and what are those things that are, ancillary to it that are necessary but don't add any value. And that's where, I always look for. I always look for when you have to go look around chasing people for moving paper around or getting approvals or picking or those kind of things. Those are the ones that you really find are big time wasters and inefficiencies that hurt productivity. The more you can touch it once, the better. And that's the probably the another way to look at it. If I can't move it from here to the next step right away, what's stopping me? And that's generally a non-value added thing.
I think that's all the official questions that we have, Rick.
Well,
Thank you very much.
Our timing worked out well.
It was great. Thank you for such an insightful presentation.
No problem at all.
This webinar is the third in a series of supply chain webinars that our organizations have partnered on. All of the videos can be viewed on the Manitoba Agriculture YouTube channel under Food Business Pathways playlist. So we encourage you to check the others out. And thank you all for your participation today.